He told her she wasn't good enough for his family, then walked away without looking back. 2 years later, he saw her again, and the twins who had his eyes. The chandelier above her shimmered with hundreds of crystal drops, scattering light over the polished table where silver gleamed and conversation floated like smoke. Emma felt like a trespasser in someone else's life. Every smile around her was rehearsed, every word carried the weight of money and lineage. She had been here before, at these dinners where she tried to fit into his world, telling herself that love could bridge the space between their lives. But tonight, as she looked across the table at Ethan Reed, she saw the distance between them for what it was, an abyss he had no intention of crossing. His jaw was tight, his expression unreadable, his blue eyes fixed on the untouched glass of wine before him. She sensed what was coming before he even opened his mouth. His mother's gaze lingered on Emma like a warning, his father's thin smile cutting through the air like a knife. Ethan's voice finally broke the hum of quiet conversation, calm but deliberate, each syllable chosen like a blade. "You don't belong here, Emma. You're not good enough for my family." The words were quiet enough that only those closest could hear, but they hit her with the force of a storm. For a heartbeat, she thought she had misheard him, that maybe he was defending her, not condemning her. But the way he looked at her, cold, final, left no room for misunderstanding. A low murmur rippled through the table, the kind of silence that carries more judgment than sound. Emma's hand trembled as she set down her glass. Her pulse roared in her ears. She tried to meet his eyes, to find some trace of the man who had once held her like she was his entire world, but there was only a stranger sitting there in a tailored suit, playing the obedient son. She swallowed the ache rising in her throat, forcing herself to breathe evenly. "I see," she said softly, her voice barely audible. She could have begged, could have asked him if all their moments, the laughter, the promises whispered in the dark, meant nothing. But she didn't. She saw the relief flicker in his mother's eyes, and that was enough. Emma rose slowly from her seat. The chair scraped the marble floor, the sound sharp and final. Her legs felt weak, but she held her head high as she turned toward the exit. Ethan didn't follow her. He didn't move. He just sat there, his hands clasped tightly, his gaze fixed on the table, as if the sight of her leaving was something he couldn't bear to witness. Outside, the night was cold. The air bit at her cheeks, but the chill was nothing compared to the hollow ache in her chest. She walked down the long driveway, her heels clicking against the stones, her breath unsteady. The car that had brought her here was gone, sent away hours earlier. She didn't care. She needed distance, space, anything to drown out the sound of his voice repeating in her head. "You're not good enough for my family." By the time she reached the main road, tears had already blurred her vision, but she didn't stop walking. The lights of the city shimmered in the distance, distant and indifferent. Somewhere deep down, she had known this day would come. Men like Ethan Reed didn't defy their world, they obeyed it. Still, knowing didn't make the wound any smaller. That night, she packed her few belongings in silence. The apartment they had shared felt smaller now, filled with ghosts of laughter that no longer belonged to her. She found one of his shirts draped over the chair and pressed it to her face. The scent of him, the faint trace of cologne, the warmth of his skin, broke her composure at last. She sank onto the bed and let the tears come, deep and soundless, until there was nothing left inside her but exhaustion. In the morning, she left without leaving a note. The sun rose indifferent, bright over the city that never cared who loved or who broke. She walked to the train station, clutching her bag, her hands trembling, but her chin lifted high. When the train pulled away, she didn't look back. It was only weeks later, sitting alone in a small clinic room with the sound of rain tapping against the window, that she saw the two faint pink lines appear on the test in her hand. Her breath caught, the world tilting. For a long moment she couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't even cry. Then she pressed a hand to her stomach, her pulse racing beneath her fingers. It was no longer just her story. It was theirs. And even though Ethan's voice still echoed in her mind, cold and final, she whispered quietly to the life growing inside her, "You are enough." The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion, fear, and fragile determination. Emma had never felt so utterly alone and yet so fiercely protective of something she barely understood. The clinic visit had changed everything. The faint heartbeat she heard through the doctor's stethoscope became the anchor that kept her from falling apart completely. She moved through her small apartment like someone relearning how to exist. Her morning sickness was relentless, her body aching, her emotions unsteady, but she clung to one thought, that the tiny life inside her depended on her strength. Work at the bookshop became her refuge. The owner, an older woman named Margaret, noticed Emma's pale face and trembling hands but didn't ask questions. She simply started giving her shorter shifts, more breaks, and warm tea that smelled of honey and chamomile. The quiet rhythm of stacking books, dusting shelves, and listening to the soft murmur of customers gave Emma moments of peace. Sometimes she would place her hand gently on her stomach and whisper to herself that everything would be all right, even when she didn't believe it. At night, the loneliness returned. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying Ethan's words again and again until they twisted into something surreal. "You're not good enough for my family." The cruelty of it wasn't just in what he said, but in how easily he said it, how little it seemed to cost him. She wanted to hate him. Sometimes she almost succeeded. But then, in the stillness of those nights, she would remember how he used to look at her when they were alone, when his eyes softened, when he touched her like she was made of something precious, and the hatred would dissolve into grief. When the first snow of winter fell, Emma stood by the window watching the streets turn white. She thought about calling him once, not to beg or accuse, but to tell him that their story wasn't as finished as he thought. Her fingers hovered over her phone, trembling, before she locked it again and pressed it to her chest. He had chosen his world, and she would have to build hers without him. The months crept by slowly. Her belly grew rounder, her reflection softer. Strangers started smiling at her on the street, holding doors open, asking kind questions. The small gestures meant more than she could explain. One evening, when she was 7 months along, she felt the first real kick. It startled her so much she laughed out loud, tears rising at the same time. That small movement reminded her that she wasn't as lost as she thought. There was purpose inside her now, growing stronger every day. The birth came on a cold night in early spring. It was harder than anything she had ever endured. The pain tore through her like fire, and there were moments she thought she couldn't survive it. But when the cries of 2 newborn girls filled the room, the world stopped spinning. She stared at them, tiny, perfect, both wrapped in white blankets, and felt something sacred settle inside her chest. One had her lips, the other his eyes, both of them impossibly beautiful. The nurse placed them in her arms, and Emma wept silently, not out of despair this time but from a love so overwhelming it felt like light filling every dark corner she had carried for months. She kissed their foreheads and whispered their names softly, as if speaking a promise into the universe. Sophia. Lily. The hospital nights were long and sleepless, but she didn't mind. She would sit with them pressed against her, memorizing their faces, their soft breathing, the warmth of their skin. Every sound, every movement, every tiny sigh was proof that she had survived what was meant to destroy her. When Margaret came to visit with flowers and tears in her eyes, Emma smiled for the first time in months. She left the hospital 2 weeks later with both babies bundled in her arms, stepping into the cool morning light. The city still moved with the same indifferent rhythm, but to her it looked different now. Every sound, every shadow, every gust of wind felt alive. She had no money, no family, no man to lean on, but she had something stronger than all of that. She had them. And for the first time since Ethan's words had broken her heart, she no longer felt small. She no longer felt not enough. The weight of two tiny bodies in her arms made her realize she was more than enough, because love, the quiet, fierce, selfless kind, was already remaking her into someone new. The following years became a rhythm of survival and tenderness. The small apartment Emma rented was far from the life she once imagined, but it became a world of warmth, love, and quiet laughter. Every corner smelled faintly of baby powder and milk. Every morning began before sunrise, with the soft cries of Sophia or Lily echoing in the stillness. The exhaustion was constant, but so was the joy. There were moments when she thought her body would collapse from sleeplessness, yet one look at their tiny faces gave her strength she never knew she possessed. She learned to do everything alone. Feedings, laundry, night terrors, doctor visits, all of it became part of her life like a second skin. There was no time to think about the past anymore, and maybe that was her blessing. Sometimes, when she caught her reflection in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The delicate girl Ethan once knew had been replaced by a woman with tired eyes but unshakable resolve. She no longer cared about being perfect, she cared about keeping her daughter safe, warm, and smiling. The bookshop remained her refuge. Margaret had become more than an employer, she was a friend, almost like family. She let Emma bring the twins on quiet afternoons when business was slow. The little girls would sit near the reading corner surrounded by books, their curious eyes watching everything. Customers often stopped to smile at them, commenting on how identical they looked, how striking their blue eyes were. Emma would smile politely, but inside she felt a bittersweet sting every time someone mentioned those eyes, because they were Ethan's. Sophia was the talkative one, fearless and stubborn. Lily was quieter, observant, with a smile that appeared slowly, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Emma saw pieces of herself in both, but there was something undeniably his in their mannerisms. Sometimes she would watch them playing and wonder if he ever thought of her, if he ever dreamed of the life he had thrown away so easily. She told herself it didn't matter, that she had no room for those thoughts anymore, yet the question lingered somewhere deep, refusing to fade completely. Winter returned, coating the streets in pale light. The girls had turned too, their laughter now filling every silence that used to haunt Emma. They liked to run through the small park near their home, bundled in coats and scarves, their cheeks pink from the cold. Emma would chase after them, breathless but smiling, her heart full in a way she had never known before. For all the struggles, she knew she had built something beautiful out of the ashes of what was lost. Still, there were nights when the ache returned, soft and persistent. After she put the girls to sleep, she would sit by the window, the city lights flickering beyond the glass. She would think of him, not with hatred anymore, but with a kind of distant sadness. She wondered what he was doing, if he had built the life his family wanted for him. She imagined him surrounded by luxury, but with that familiar emptiness behind his eyes. A part of her almost pitied him for not knowing what love truly looked like. One evening, Sophia woke up crying from a bad dream. Emma rushed to her side, gathering her in her arms. The child buried her face in her mother's neck, trembling. "It's all right, my love," Emma whispered softly, rocking her gently. "Mommy's here." Lily stirred in her sleep but didn't wake. The room was dim, filled with shadows, and Emma felt the weight of both joy and fear pressing against her chest. She realized then that no matter how far she ran from her past, it lived within her children, their eyes, their smiles, their very existence. The next morning, she dressed the twins and took them to the market. The sun was weak but warm enough to hint at spring. As they walked past shop windows, she caught sight of her reflection again, her hair loose, a tired smile on her lips, two small hands gripping hers. She looked older, wiser, and somehow more beautiful than she ever did in her past life. Because this version of herself had been forged by love, pain, and resilience. By the time they returned home, the girls were laughing, singing a nonsense song they had made up together. Emma watched them from the doorway, her heart swelling with pride. She no longer needed Ethan's validation. She didn't need his name or his world. Her daughters were her legacy now, her redemption, her reason to keep moving forward. And yet, as she tucked them into bed that night, she couldn't help but whisper quietly, as if to herself, "I hope someday he knows what he lost." Then she kissed their foreheads, turned off the light, and stood for a long time in the doorway, listening to their soft breathing. Outside, snow began to fall again, silent and endless, covering everything in white. To anyone else, it was just another winter night. But to Emma, it was a reminder that even the coldest seasons eventually give way to warmth again. Ethan Reed's life had become a polished performance. Every morning began with the same quiet precision: a tailored suit, an untouched breakfast, a waiting driver, and an agenda filled with meetings that never seemed to end. The newspapers still called him one of the most powerful young CEOs in the country, a man who had taken his family's empire and expanded it beyond what even his father thought possible. On the surface, he had everything he had once been told to want: wealth, respect, and the approval of those whose opinions had once mattered. But somewhere in the process of building the perfect life, he had lost the ability to feel alive inside it. He had tried to convince himself that this was maturity, that detachment was strength. He dated women his parents approved of, elegant, well-educated, perfectly trained to play the part of a socialite. Madison, the one who currently stood at his side during every corporate dinner and charity gala, was beautiful in a way that drew attention effortlessly. She smiled for the cameras, knew which charities to praise, and always spoke just enough to seem gracious but never too much to be remembered for the wrong reason. To everyone else, they were the image of perfection. But when the lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed, silence stretched between them like an ocean. She would scroll through her phone or retreat to another room, and he would sit alone by the window, staring out over the glittering skyline, wondering when life had become something he was simply enduring. It was during one of those nights that he saw her again, not Emma, but a trace of her, uninvited in a dream that left him shaken. In the dream she was standing in a field bathed in soft sunlight, her hair loose, her laughter faint and far away. He tried to walk toward her, but no matter how far he moved, the distance between them never closed. When he woke, the emptiness pressed against his ribs so sharply that he had to sit up just to breathe. He told himself it was just memory, nostalgia, guilt maybe. But the truth was more insidious: he had never stopped thinking about her. He had buried her deep beneath ambition and pride, and still she lived there, stubborn as heartbeat. In meetings, he found himself distracted by small, meaningless details: someone's perfume that reminded him of her skin, the way sunlight filtered through a window, the sight of a mother carrying a child on the street below. These moments felt like ghosts tugging at the corners of his vision, reminders of a life he had thrown away because he lacked the courage to fight for it. His parents still spoke to him with the same measured pride, as though his success justified every sacrifice. Yet when his mother mentioned Madison, calling her the right kind of woman, he felt nothing but a cold wave of regret. One evening, Madison invited him to a charity gala held at a hotel downtown. The ballroom was filled with glittering gowns, murmured conversations, and the faint sound of a jazz quartet. He went because it was expected, because appearances still mattered. But as he stood among the crowd, a thought came to him so suddenly that it startled him: he didn't belong here either. He might have looked the part, but inside he felt like an imposter in his own life. He excused himself early, claiming exhaustion, and walked out into the city streets. The night air was cool, brushing against his skin as he loosened his tie and kept walking with no destination. He passed cafes and shops, people laughing under the glow of streetlights. It was late enough that the world felt quieter, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to think about the past without turning away. He remembered Emma's voice, the warmth of her hand on his cheek, the way she looked at him like she believed there was good in him even when he couldn't see it himself. He remembered the night she left, the echo of her footsteps fading as he sat frozen, too cowardly to go after her. When he returned home, he poured himself a drink and sat in the dark, staring at the amber liquid catching the faint reflection of city lights. His mind kept circling back to the same question: what if she had stayed? Would he have become a different man? Or had he destroyed something that was never meant to be rebuilt? He told himself it didn't matter anymore, but the thought lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. Weeks passed, and he went through the motions of his life, but the restlessness grew stronger. He began avoiding social events, skipping dinners, ignoring calls from Madison until she finally stopped trying. His assistant noticed his temper fraying, his attention slipping during meetings. One afternoon, while reviewing a proposal, he saw a photograph in the file, a local bookstore partnering with one of their community programs. It was small, ordinary, unremarkable. But behind the window of the shop, blurred by the reflection of light, he thought he saw a familiar silhouette. For a moment, he forgot how to breathe. It wasn't clear, and yet something in him shifted instantly, an instinct so deep it almost hurt. That night he drove past the neighborhood where the photo had been taken. It was quiet and old-fashioned, a place that smelled of rain and wood smoke. He didn't stop, didn't get out of the car. He just sat there for a long time, watching the light from the shop spill faintly onto the sidewalk, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He didn't know what he was looking for or why he had come, only that something inside him refused to let him leave easily. By the time he drove home, dawn was breaking. The city was waking up, golden light spreading across the skyline. He parked the car, leaned his head against the seat, and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, Ethan Reed admitted to himself that all the success, all the status, all the power meant nothing if he had to live in a world where she no longer existed beside him. But it was too late, or at least that's what he believed then, not knowing that fate had already begun weaving the threads that would bring their paths together again, just when both of them thought the past was gone forever. It was an ordinary afternoon when their worlds collided again, though nothing about the moment felt ordinary to Ethan. The city was dressed in the dull gray of late winter, the kind of day when people moved quickly between buildings to avoid the chill in the air. He had spent the morning in endless meetings that blurred into each other, all numbers and voices and false smiles. When his assistant reminded him of another appointment downtown, he canceled it without explanation and told the driver to take a different route. He didn't know why he said it, only that something restless inside him refused to sit through another meaningless meeting. The car slowed near a row of small restaurants and shops, the kind of street that existed far away from his polished world. Through the window he noticed a restaurant with warm lighting spilling onto the pavement, fogged glass hinting at laughter and conversation inside. He almost told the driver to keep going, but for some reason, he didn't. He asked to stop. The driver looked surprised but obeyed, and Ethan stepped out into the cold. He adjusted his coat and walked toward the door, the bell above it chiming softly as he entered. The warmth hit him instantly, along with the scent of coffee and fresh bread. He glanced around, searching for a quiet corner. Then he saw her. She was sitting near the window, a soft scarf around her neck, her hair loose and gleaming under the golden light. Two little girls sat across from her, identical in every way except for the way they smiled, one shy, one bold. They were laughing at something she said, their small hands reaching for her as she helped them cut pieces of pastry. For a moment he couldn't move. His breath caught in his throat, and the entire room seemed to fade into silence. Emma. The name rushed through him like a memory he had buried too deep to recognize at first. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, though she hadn't even noticed him yet. The girls looked about 3, maybe a little older, their hair dark and shining, their eyes impossibly blue. His mind struggled to process it, his body frozen in place. It wasn't possible. And yet it was. He took a step closer, every sound around him suddenly distant. The older girl turned her head, her gaze catching on him for just a second. She smiled, a wide and fearless smile, and he felt his chest tighten painfully. It was his smile. He knew it instantly, the same curve of the lips, the same spark of mischief he saw in the mirror as a child. The room tilted slightly, and he had to grip the back of a chair to steady himself. Emma finally looked up. The color drained from her face, though she didn't flinch. For a heartbeat they just stared at each other, time collapsing between them. He saw the years written in the lines of her expression, the exhaustion and strength carved together into something beautiful and real. She looked older, yes, but also more alive than anyone he had seen in years. The girls were chattering beside her, tugging her sleeve, but she didn't take her eyes off him. Ethan realized that if he spoke now, his voice would betray the tremor in his chest. So he didn't. He stood there like a man caught between past and present, the weight of regret pressing against his lungs until it hurt to breathe. She turned away first, pretending to focus on the children, her fingers shaking slightly as she lifted a napkin. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she fought to remain composed. He sat down at a table nearby, unable to leave. Every part of him wanted to approach her, but fear held him back, not fear of rejection, but of seeing himself reflected in her eyes as the man who had once destroyed her. The waitress asked what he wanted, but he didn't hear her until she repeated the question twice. He ordered something without thinking, his gaze never leaving the table by the window. When the girls began to get restless, Emma gathered their things. She paid quickly and stood, helping them with their coats. One of the girls looked back at him again, curious, her small hand gripping her mother's fingers. That simple, innocent glance tore through him. He couldn't stop himself this time. He stood, stepping closer, his voice low but firm. "Emma." She froze. For a second, she didn't turn around. Then slowly, she looked over her shoulder, her eyes meeting his. "Ethan," she said quietly. The sound of his name from her lips nearly undid him. The girls looked up at her, confused. "Mommy, who's that?" the younger one asked softly. Emma hesitated before answering. "Just someone I used to know." The words hit him harder than he expected, like a physical blow. He wanted to tell her he had never stopped thinking of her, that not a single day had passed without her ghost haunting him. But standing there in front of her, with those two children, his children, he was certain now, he couldn't find the courage to say anything. He took another step forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're yours?" She met his eyes with quiet defiance. "Ours," she said simply. The word hung in the air between them, sharp and undeniable. He didn't speak again. He couldn't. She turned and walked toward the door, holding the girls' hands tightly. He watched them leave, the bell above the door chiming faintly as they disappeared into the gray afternoon. For a long time after that, he remained standing in the middle of the restaurant, staring at the spot where she had been. People around him went on with their meals, oblivious, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But for Ethan, the world had just split open. Every lie he had told himself, that he'd moved on, that she was better off without him, that he had made the right choice, collapsed in a single instant. He sat back down slowly, his hands trembling, his throat burning with unshed words. When he finally left the restaurant, the sky had darkened and snow was beginning to fall, soft flakes landing on his coat like silent accusations. He stood there on the sidewalk, looking down the street where she had vanished, his heart pounding in uneven rhythm. He didn't know how, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he couldn't lose her again. Not now, not after seeing what he had thrown away. And this time, he wouldn't let fear decide for him. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study with the city lights flickering against the tall glass windows, his thoughts chasing themselves in circles. He kept seeing her face, the way her expression had hardened when she looked at him, the way she had pulled the girls close as though shielding them from him. Every detail was carved into his mind, the small curls in their hair, the way one of them tilted her head when she smiled, the identical blue of their eyes that mirrored his own. He had spent years mastering control, but all of it shattered in a single afternoon. The world that once revolved around numbers, contracts, and power suddenly felt meaningless. For the first time, he understood what regret could do. It could hollow out a man completely until nothing was left but the echo of what he'd lost. He tried to tell himself to be rational. Maybe he was mistaken. Maybe those girls weren't his. But no matter how many explanations he built, his heart rejected them all. He knew. He had known the moment the older one smiled. The recognition had been so immediate it felt biological, something older than thought. They were his daughters, and he had missed every first word, every sleepless night, every laugh. He had missed their entire lives because of a decision he had made to protect a reputation that now felt like dust in his hands. The next morning, he drove back to the restaurant. The staff remembered her, of course. They remembered the woman with 2 little girls, always polite, always smiling. But they didn't know much else. One of them thought she might live nearby, another mentioned a small bookstore she sometimes visited. It was barely a clue, but he clung to it as if it were a lifeline. He spent days walking through that part of the city, scanning faces, looking through shop windows, asking quietly in places where no one cared who he was. And then, one afternoon, he found the bookshop. It was small and unassuming, tucked between a flower store and a bakery, its windows filled with faded posters and handwritten notes. The bell above the door chimed when he entered, and the faint smell of old paper and coffee filled the air. He saw her instantly behind the counter, sorting through a stack of books. Her hair was tied back this time, her expression calm but tired. She didn't see him at first, and for a moment he just watched her, unable to move. There was something profoundly peaceful about the way she moved, efficient but gentle, like someone who had learned to find beauty in ordinary things. When she finally looked up, the calmness vanished from her face. Her breath caught, and her hands stilled on the counter. "Ethan," she said quietly, his name tasting like disbelief. He stepped closer but didn't try to reach her. "Emma," he began, his voice low, almost hoarse. "I need to talk to you." She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then shook her head. "There's nothing to talk about." Her words were steady, but he could hear the strain beneath them. He tried again. "Please. Just a few minutes." She hesitated, glanced toward the door that led to the back room, then sighed. "Fine. 5 minutes." They sat at a small table near the window. The sunlight filtered through the glass, touching her hair with warmth. She didn't look at him directly, instead focusing on the street outside. "They're my daughters," she said finally, her tone even but sharp as a blade. "You don't get to come back after all this time and act surprised." He swallowed hard, guilt tightening in his chest. "I didn't know, Emma. You didn't tell me." She turned to him, her eyes blazing. "You made sure I couldn't. You threw me out of your life, Ethan. Out of your family's world. You told me I wasn't good enough to stand next to you. What did you expect me to do, come crawling back, pregnant, begging for approval?" Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, but she held his gaze. He wanted to argue, to tell her that he had been young, pressured, afraid. But the truth was, there was no excuse that could make it right. "I was wrong," he said finally, the words tasting like ash. "I was a coward. I thought I was protecting something that mattered, but I was just protecting my own pride." Her eyes softened for a fraction of a second, then hardened again. "That's the thing about pride. It doesn't mean much when you're holding a baby alone in the middle of the night." Silence stretched between them. Outside, people walked by the window, oblivious to the storm brewing on the other side of the glass. He looked at her hands, the faint ink stains on her fingers, the small silver ring she wore, simple, worn, not a wedding band. "I want to be in their lives," he said quietly. "Please. Let me at least try." Emma shook her head slowly. "It's not that simple. They don't know you. They have their life, their routine. I won't let you walk in and turn it upside down because you suddenly remembered how to feel." Her words cut deep, but he didn't flinch. "Then let me earn it," he said. "Let me prove I can be the man I should have been from the start." For a long time, she didn't speak. Then she sighed, exhaustion shadowing her face. "I don't trust you," she said softly. "Not yet. But they deserve to know the truth someday." He nodded, a mix of relief and sorrow washing over him. "That's all I ask." Their conversation ended not with closure, but with a fragile thread of possibility. As he left the bookstore, the air outside felt sharper, but lighter somehow. He looked back once and saw her standing by the window, watching him go, her expression unreadable. He knew it would take time, weeks, months, maybe years, but he also knew one thing with certainty. He wasn't going to disappear again. That night, for the first time in years, Ethan slept. Not because the guilt had faded, but because he finally had a reason to wake up and try to make things right. And though Emma didn't yet believe in him, he believed in her, in them, in the fragile, painful chance that maybe it wasn't too late to rebuild what he had destroyed. Ethan began appearing in small, careful ways, never demanding, never forcing himself into spaces that weren't ready to hold him. At first, it was awkward, the kind of silence that feels both heavy and fragile at once. He would stop by the bookstore on afternoons when the twins were there, bringing them a storybook or small pastries from the cafe across the street. He never stayed long, only long enough to see their eyes light up, to listen to their laughter, to feel something warm and new bloom inside him. Emma always stood nearby, guarded, her arms often crossed, her expression neutral but not unkind. There were moments when he could see her resolve waver slightly, the way her eyes softened when the girls ran to him or when he made them laugh. Still, she never lowered her guard completely, and he didn't ask her to. The twins, Sophia and Lily, accepted him without questions at first. To them, he was simply Ethan, a friendly man with the same blue eyes they saw in the mirror, the one who always listened to their endless stories and never grew tired of their questions. Over time, Emma noticed how naturally they seemed to connect with him. It was as though something instinctive bridged the space between them. When they laughed together, the sound carried through the bookstore, bright and genuine, and though it made Emma's chest tighten, she couldn't bring herself to stop it. Watching them together made her ache, but it also reminded her of something she had tried to bury, the man Ethan might have become if life, and pride, hadn't broken him. He never spoke of the past. He didn't apologize over and over or try to rewrite what had happened. Instead, he showed up, consistently, quietly, sincerely. When one of the girls got sick, he brought soup and children's medicine without being asked. When Emma's shift ran late, he stayed to help clean the shop, stacking books with a patience that surprised her. The man who once lived behind walls of arrogance now stood before her humbled and changed, and that transformation unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Sometimes she caught herself watching him when he wasn't looking, noticing small things she had forgotten. The way his jaw tightened when he concentrated, the faint scar on his hand from a long-ago accident, the quiet way he smiled at the girls as though he couldn't quite believe they were real. And yet, each time her heart began to soften, the memory of that night, the night he told her she wasn't good enough, rose up like a shadow, reminding her of everything she had endured alone. She wanted to forgive, but forgiveness, she had learned, was not a single act. It was a process, slow and uncertain, filled with both pain and peace. One evening in early spring, the girls had fallen asleep on the rug of the bookstore, surrounded by open picture books. The light outside had faded into a soft gray, and the rain tapped gently against the windows. Emma sat behind the counter, finishing some paperwork, while Ethan carefully lifted the twins one by one and carried them to the small sofa in the back. His movements were tender and deliberate, as though the slightest noise might break something sacred. She watched him tuck the blankets around them, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's forehead, and something inside her cracked quietly. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a recognition of love still existing despite everything. Afterward, he sat across from her at the counter. The silence between them was different this time, no longer filled with tension, but with the quiet awareness of people who had both survived something immense. "They're incredible," he said softly, his gaze still lingering toward the back of the room. Emma nodded, her voice barely audible when she answered, "They saved me." He looked at her then, and she saw in his eyes not pity but respect, the kind that only comes from truly understanding someone's pain. He hesitated before speaking again, his tone careful. "I know I can't change what happened. I can't erase what I said or how I made you feel. But I want to be someone they can count on. And if you'll let me, I want to be someone you can count on too, not because I expect anything in return, but because it's the only way I can live with myself." His honesty disarmed her more than any apology could have. She looked at him for a long time, studying his face, searching for traces of the man she once loved. There he was, but tempered by loss and regret, shaped into something deeper, quieter, more human. She didn't answer him right away, only whispered, "You already missed so much." He nodded, pain flickering across his face. "I know," he said. "That's what keeps me awake at night. But I can be here now, if you'll let me." The next morning, when he returned to the bookstore, Emma didn't stop him from joining them for breakfast. He helped the girls pour milk into their cereal bowls, laughed when they spilled, and stayed until they had to leave for preschool. Emma stood in the doorway, watching as the three of them walked down the street together, her daughter's small hands gripping his. It was a simple moment, quiet and unremarkable, but to her it felt like witnessing the first light after a long, endless night. That night, when the girls were asleep, she sat by the window of her apartment, looking out over the city. She thought about everything she had survived, about how pain could turn into strength if you let it. She wasn't ready to trust him completely, not yet, but she realized she wanted to try. Maybe not for herself, but for the two little hearts sleeping in the next room who deserved a father who finally understood what it meant to love. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the dark sky. Emma pressed her hand to the glass, her reflection faint but steady, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps the story wasn't over. Perhaps it was only beginning again, in a different way, slowly, carefully, but truthfully this time. The seasons shifted again, and time began to move differently, no longer marked by pain but by small, almost invisible moments of healing. Ethan became a steady part of their lives, not through grand gestures or apologies, but through quiet constancy. He was there every morning the twins wanted pancakes instead of cereal, every afternoon they begged to visit the park, every night Emma needed help carrying them upstairs after they fell asleep in the car. He didn't try to replace what was lost, he simply filled the spaces where he had once been absent. The girls adored him, and it showed in every laugh, every hand-drawn picture they proudly brought him, every time they shouted his name across the street. Emma watched it all unfold, torn between gratitude and fear, her heart opening little by little in ways she couldn't stop even if she wanted to. She had always imagined that forgiveness would be a single moment, a quiet realization that the past no longer hurt. But it didn't happen that way. Forgiveness came to her slowly, like a tide returning after years of drought. There were still nights when she remembered his words, when she felt the sting of betrayal as though it had happened yesterday. Yet there were also mornings when she saw the way he looked at their daughters, eyes full of unguarded love, and something inside her softened. She realized she no longer saw the man who had once hurt her. She saw a father, a partner, a human being who had been broken too, and who was now trying to make himself whole again, one small act at a time. One late afternoon, as the sun poured gold through the bookstore windows, he arrived just before closing. The girls were in the back, coloring while Emma organized the shelves. Ethan walked in quietly, holding a small, worn box in his hands. She turned when she heard him, brushing hair from her face. "You're early," she said, her tone light but curious. He nodded, setting the box on the counter. "I wanted to show you something." Inside were old photographs, his mother, his father, himself as a child, his first office, pieces of a life she had never been allowed to see before. At the bottom was a photograph of the four of them together now, taken by one of the twins a week earlier. The image was crooked, the lighting uneven, but it was real. She looked at it for a long time before lifting her gaze to him. "You kept this?" she asked quietly. "I keep everything that matters," he said. For the first time in years, she didn't look away. The air between them shifted, no longer heavy with unspoken anger but fragile with understanding. He stepped closer, hesitating before saying, "Emma, I don't expect anything from you. I know I don't deserve a second chance, but I need you to know that I'm not leaving again. Not ever. Not because I feel guilty or because it's the right thing to do, but because you and the girls are the only part of my life that feels real." She stood there, her hands resting on the edge of the counter, her heart beating unevenly. There was truth in his voice, raw, unpolished, unguarded. For a long time, she said nothing, then simply whispered, "You already left once." He nodded slowly. "Then let me spend the rest of my life proving I won't do it again." That night, as the city hummed quietly outside, the four of them sat together in the small apartment. The girls fell asleep between them, one curled against Emma's side, the other sprawled across Ethan's lap. The television flickered softly in the background, forgotten. Emma watched the steady rise and fall of her daughter's breathing and then looked at Ethan. His head was leaned back against the couch, his eyes half closed, his expression peaceful in a way she had never seen before. In that moment, she realized something simple but profound: love wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about choosing to build something stronger in spite of it. Months passed, and the quiet rhythm of their new life settled into something stable and gentle. Ethan found ways to balance his work without letting it consume him, and Emma began to trust that his promises weren't just words. There were still disagreements and difficult days, moments when fear resurfaced or when old wounds ached unexpectedly. But there was also laughter, more of it than she remembered ever hearing before. On weekends, they would take the girls to the park, and sometimes, as the twins ran ahead chasing the light, Ethan would reach for Emma's hand. The first time he did it, she didn't pull away. The warmth of his touch wasn't the same as it once was, it was quieter, deeper, earned. One evening in early summer, the air was warm and filled with the smell of rain. The girls were asleep upstairs when Emma found him standing on the balcony, looking out over the city. She joined him, leaning on the railing beside him. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. "You were right," she said softly. "About what?" he asked. "About the things that matter," she replied. "They're not what I thought they'd be. They're smaller, but they're everything." He smiled faintly, turning toward her. "I don't deserve you," he said, his voice low. "Maybe not," she said with a small smile, "but they deserve you. And maybe that's enough." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "You're my family, Emma," he said. "You always were. I just didn't know how to see it before." Her eyes softened, and she felt the last of her walls crumble. "Then don't look away this time," she whispered. In the quiet that followed, the world seemed to slow down. The city lights flickered in the distance, the wind carried the faint sound of laughter from somewhere far below, and for the first time in years, she felt completely at peace. They stood there together, not as two people haunted by what had been, but as a family rebuilt from the pieces of pain, forgiveness, and love that had somehow found their way back to each other. It wasn't a perfect ending, because real life never is. But it was honest, and it was theirs. And as the night deepened around them, Emma knew that sometimes, the most beautiful stories are the ones that break first, and then find their way home.